Back in the 70s, I think, there was a song titled Why Me, Lord? I I was working in food service at the time, and they had a jukebox where I worked. So I heard the song a number of times. I don't remember what the words were. Probably didn't pay attention to them then. But definitely, I asked the question a number of times, as you probably have too, why me? Why is each and every one of us called here today? Why not everybody else? And here's another question, when? When did we get called? I remember driving down the street in the 70s and listening to Gardner Ted Armstrong. He'd say something that I didn't agree with. I'd say, I like the radio, I can turn it off. My purpose today is to consider this question, brethren, for both of us, for all of us, both questions for all of us, why and when. Why were we called and when were we called? And the benefit of this really for me is singular. Although we can't answer either question specifically, it can help us catch a glimpse of the awesome mind of our great God. I'd like to start by turning to John, the 2nd chapter, and we'll look at the 23rd verse. And Jesus says something here that's very, very interesting. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard. John 2:23, we read, when he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs that he was doing. And in verse 24 it says, but Jesus on his part would not entrust himself to them because he knew all people. Okay, well, here's what Adam Clark says about that. He says that to know them is a different word than you and I knowing each other, for example. In the case of Jesus Christ, he knew every man, meaning he knew what was inside of every man. Now here's a clue as to why me. Verse 25, he had no need that anyone should testify of man because he knew what was in man. I counted up at that point, and he had, I believe, at that particular moment, called at least 4 of the disciples who were going to be following him. We know, brethren, from John 6:44, that no man can come to Christ unless the Father draws him. Okay. We sang hundreds of times the song that used to be number 1 in our hymnal. It's still in our hymnal. It's not number 1. It speaks about a tree being planted by the water. A few years back, Mr. Gary Petty, speaking in a sermon, said that God has planted each and every one of us. We've all been planted by God. Let's take a look at John, the 8th chapter. You're in John, so we just have to turn over a few pages. Here he's speaking to the Pharisees. And he says something that's easy to understand, but not for them. In verse 43, he says, why do you not understand my speech? Because you're not able to listen to my word. Okay. Well, recall in Matthew 13, the disciples came to Christ, and they said, why do you talk to them in parables? And he gave them a very interesting answer. He said in a word, so they won't get it. So they won't understand it. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians, the 1st chapter. When he told them that, he was quoting Isaiah, the 6th chapter, the 9th verse. So that had been written down hundreds of years before he said it. 1 Corinthians, the 1st chapter. We have a hymn that speaks of this also, and I will say that when I first sang the hymn, I didn't like it. I didn't like it because it didn't tell me that I was real smart. But I got to liking it a lot better as years went by. It's one of my favorites now. In the 26th verse of 1 Corinthians 1, it says, for you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. So this is another clue as to why God called us. Okay, what about when? Well, I mentioned hearing a broadcast in the 70s. Let's take a look at 2 Timothy. And of course, that broadcast had been around by the time I heard it. So when was I called? Well, in the 70s, that would have put me in my in my 30s. 2 Timothy 1, Paul is speaking here to Timothy in verse 9, and he's going to give us a clue as to both when and why. Why and when. He says, God who has saved us and called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, but according to his own purpose. There is another reason why. And grace which was given to us in Christ when? Wow, before time began. Now, what does that mean? I brought a prop with me today. I haven't done this for a long time, but I had to bring it because I found it at home. I found them. It's a pair of shoes. Now you can laugh. One of them has laces, one of them doesn't. And I'm going to be honest. At one point in life, I wore these shoes. It was 1942. They were purchased for me. I had a way of losing the laces. I don't know how I did that. But these are my shoes, and now I got another prop I've got to give you. It's a photograph that was taken in 1942. A photograph that was taken in 1942, and quite honestly, you might not be able to see it because you're sitting back pretty far, but it's a photograph of a young boy who's wearing those shoes. Now you may notice something strange about this photograph. He's wearing a bib, but then really he isn't. My mother was far too wise than to put a bib on me. She was using a bath towel. And the reason that she was using a bath towel was because she gave me one of the two memories that I hold when I was 2 years old. She gave me on my birth date chocolate cake with fudge frosting. Oh, I remember two things from the time I was 2 years old. That was one. In my 2 full years of experiences, I had never tasted anything as dreamy as chocolate cake with fudge frosting. And the fudge frosting, as you can see, is all over the bath towel that's on the front of me. So the question I have is, was I called at that point? Let's look at Psalm 139. This is David speaking. When we read in 2 Timothy, the first chapter, the King James says that this was before the world began, and the New Revised Standard says before the ages began. That's quite a while ago. David in Psalm 139 verse 16 says this, "Your eyes saw my substance, yet being unformed, and in your book they were all written. The days fashioned for me when there was, yet they were none of them." Brethren, I believe I was called long before that photograph was taken. That means I was called before I wore these shoes, if you can imagine that. Let's look at Jeremiah chapter 1. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. Now, of course, here he's speaking to Jeremiah, but the same is true for us. In verse 5, he says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you, and I ordained you a prophet to the nations." What kind of a mind can know somebody before galaxies were formed? The same is true, brethren, for each and every one of us. God had identified the ones he wanted. Why? Well, let's turn to 2 Corinthians, please. I know it has nothing to do with some great righteousness that I possessed, nor did it have to do with my intelligence. I'm going to read 2 Corinthians 4:7 from the New Revised Standard. New Revised Standard, 2 Corinthians 4, verse 7 says, "We have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us." We call John 17 the Lord's Prayer. And you don't have to turn there, but in verse 15, Christ prayed, "I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I'm not of the world. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth." That's verses 15 through 17. Okay, why me? When me? Honestly, either way, I don't know. But I know this. God sees value in each of us. We've all fallen short, but brethren, by his amazing, amazing strength and power, he sees the potential of perfection in each and every one of us.